studio, and if you were listening to Talk About Iowa this morning, you heard me talking to these two gentlemen earlier today. So yes, we will be continuing our conversation. And of course, you know, Lowell Soike is the author of the new book, Necessary Courage, Iowa's Underground Railroad and the Struggle Against Slavery. And archaeologist Doug Jones is also here. And we're going to chat for just a few minutes to set the scene. In this book, there are remarkable stories that both of you have been researching now for 11 years. And it would be a lot of fun to sit here and talk about these stories, but apparently we don't have time to do that. But let's go back in time. We know that Iowa was not a slave state. Slavery was never legal in the state of Iowa, although that didn't necessarily make Iowa an anti-slavery state. Can you take us back before the Fugitive Slave Act and just paint a thumbnail sketch for us of how people in Iowa felt about slavery?
It was, Iowa was, oops, is that right?
Let's make sure it is. Test, yes.
Good. Iowa was one of those states that had the fortune or misfortune of being created and just in its early stages of growth when the slavery issue came to the fore. And two things really pushed that, I guess. One was the growing tension over the Mexican War acquisitions that had happened and what to do with those and whether those would become slave or free, and that got things in a bit of a turmoil. And that was sort of resolved temporarily by the Compromise of 1850, which a series of 5 bills that sort of sorted out which states would be which, and then it also would stop sale of slaves in Washington, D.C., but in exchange for that, the South got a fugitive slave law, which one big piece of it required when there were runaway slaves into the North, that the North sheriffs and other people were to help return or capture and return slaves to their owners. And so that was all going on when Iowa was just in its early years, and it was Democrat-dominated territory and state, which they were closely allied with the South, and so this was all about to change as the Southern folks that from the upper South, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and all those were moving into southern Iowa as they were southern Illinois and Missouri. There was also then the beginnings of people coming from Ohio and New York and all that, and that was helped build the tension that was starting to rise and drawing Iowa into it. And because Iowa was adjacent to Missouri, it started to feel the pressure of slaves trying to escape and come up there. They initially were all just in the early years, were just crossing the river into Illinois because Iowa had so few people that they would just not survive by running north. But that all shifted by the 1850s.
So 11 years ago, when you started the Freedom Trail Project and started researching the role of the Underground Railroad in Iowa and people who were abolitionists and were helping freedom seekers, what was actually known about the Underground Railroad in Iowa at that point?
Well, not much at all, because it was one of those stories that was always tamped down. The Democrats didn't want to, they were sympathized to the Southern point of view. They didn't want to have any stories out there that this was even going on because they wanted to tamp it all down. And folks that were trying to help the slaves, they didn't want to have it known that they were helping them because they were a clear minority in the state's viewpoint.
And they were literally risking their lives
Yes.
to do this work. I mean, Doug, as an archaeologist, starting to look for artifacts of this, obviously, there was not actually an underground railroad, we all know that, but in looking for remnants and artifacts of this kind of work, what's out there? What can you find?
Well, and that was one of the key issues with this project. Quickly, when Lowell and John Zeller, the project historian that started with the project, they quickly found out that most of these places that have been involved with these activities in Iowa are gone. And they are, if they still exist, they're archaeology sites. And so, and that's how I got involved with this project, as Lowell said, hey, where do you suppose we could find some of these places, and what do you think might be out there? And so that's been one of the challenges with this project too, because a lot of these places are just going to be like any other farmstead or house of the time period. What is going to be there that's going to clearly say that these places that once were involved with Underground Railroad activities? And the answer is, from an archaeological standpoint, it's very difficult. There are some artifacts that have surfaced that are still in the family possessions that we know about, but they aren't there at the site anymore. And so, you know, it's been a difficult part of the project, trying to go document where these places were, and then trying to figure out from the historical records, you know, were these places the place where these activities were going on? And that's been one of the great challenges of the project.
Yeah, this during this time, it was all the first generation of structures in the state. It's a lot more cabins and very rude structures, and so all that moved on by the 1870s, 80s into more prosperous second generation buildings. But not only are the individual buildings gone, but the whole communities that were existing at that time. You know, we talked about civil band and some of these rural communities. Yeah, there's a lot of towns, or one-time towns that just all gone away.
Well, and just as an example too, with the Freedom Seekers coming up, there were several communities where there were sizable populations of people arriving, either as free blacks or Freedom Seekers. Some of those places are totally gone. At Keosauqua, down in Van Buren County, there were, what was it, 200, 300 people once living in that community. It's totally gone. There's only, what, maybe 1 or 2 buildings left from that black community that once was there.
And you mentioned the historical record, and the historical record's pretty spotty from this time period as well. I mean, there are some court documents, there are newspaper accounts, but did you have, when you were looking for documentation and looking for stories, did you have an aha moment when you thought, I really can tell some of these stories?
I always thought that we could tell some of the stories, but whether we could bring them together in a way that sort of gave a context to what it all meant, these individual stories. And that's what we got passed down to us, was articles that would be we find in journals, or obituaries that would talk about a person's involvement in something, but it was usually just confined to an event, and we didn't have a sense of how that all fit into the larger thing. And so I always had confidence that we could make some sense of this, but I didn't have a good feel for how much information was out there, how much we could build upon what there was in order to really tell stories. We have there was another piece to this book called that was going to go on and included, which was called Stories in the Counties, which was sort of going to give a county by county summary of what we had learned about that, which could deal with a lot of these stories that weren't included in the book. But a lot of those are examples of stories on their way to becoming fleshed out, you know, because all we had was bits and pieces of information about what we wanted to let people know about that. Anyway, so our press thought that would be going a step too far, and to have an appendix with all that So that was left out.
Well, one of the things that I found fascinating in the book was, as time went on, I mean, slavery was a divisive issue to begin with, but as time went on, it became more and more and more so in the state of Iowa. How hot did things get?
Very hot in some communities.
I mean, there was violence, there were weapons, there were battle crimes.
Riots. There was a racial riot in Grinnell over the fact of freedom seekers being allowed to attend the school.
I have the sense that in the 1840s and 50s that the sympathies with the South were much stronger, and they were more in the majority, people not wanting to touch the issue or stay away from it all, and that these ones that were being called abolitionists were just a bunch of cranks. But by the late 1850s, I think that I have a sense that this had all pretty much turned around, and that most of the sympathies were with the other side, and I suspect it has a lot to do with just the growing tensions in Washington and Congress and stuff like that. But anyway, so that when things would happen out in the countryside, there was less chance of having a bunch of Southern sympathizers, running after you and capturing stuff. They more complained in the newspaper than actually taking action against folks.
Well, and one of the points that you brought up this morning, and I think it was you, Doug, that brought it up, a lot of the people who were anti-slavery in Iowa as time went on came to be the people in power, particularly in these small communities. There would be entire communities where the political structure was made up of people who were anti-slavery.
Right. And John Zeller brought this up in a lot of his early presentations, that the people that were involved with these activities were not the nobodies in the community. They were the big somebodies. They were the community leaders. They were the lawyers, the doctors, the clergymen. Some of the people were supposed to be enforcing the laws that they were violating.
Right, which was incredibly helpful to those trying to help freedom seekers, right?
Right, and back earlier this fall, when we had the opportunity to participate in this great history class, studying Civil War and Reconstruction and a number of other things, it was really fascinating when some of the students asked, well, you're presenting all this information about all these people who were really, and there was a wide spectrum of thought about slavery. You had some of the people that were abolitionists that thought slavery should end immediately. There were a lot of people that were just like, slavery is bad and wrong. Then you had the abolitionists, slavery is bad and wrong, it needs to end immediately.
And we can work to stop it.
Right. Well, and then you had the people that went on from there that said, slavery's wrong and bad, needs to end immediately, and you know what, we're going to do some things to help people. And then you had the real, as I call them, the lightning rods. You had the people that were so radical in the day because they believed everybody, in some cases, should have equal rights. And some of those equal rights people only, at that time too, who had rights in America at that time?
White men.
And not even all white men.
Right.
Not even all white men. And so when you start talking about rights issues, at that time, even some of the people that were supposed to be well, even some of the people that were for equal rights were not really for equal rights. Because, black men should get the opportunity to vote, but we don't think women should.
Right.
And some of these people are really complex individuals. It's really, from an anthropological perspective, it's really interesting looking at what these people believed, what they were doing, and just fascinating where they came from with these thoughts.
On the conservative end of the anti-slavery movement were what we call colonization society folks, and there were a number of those local societies around, just like there were anti-slavery societies. And I would say that still in the mid-50s, those little those communities that you're talking about with those leadership, anti-slavery communities of leadership, I'd say that they were still sort of islands in a sea of resentment, you know. Sort of,
One of my favorite pages in your book is the illustration of the pathway and that the freedom seekers would take through Iowa. And of course, it wasn't a set pathway, but of course, settlement had really only occurred in the eastern part of the state and the southern part of the state. But I was struck by how focused the stops on the Underground Railroad were in the southern 4 tiers of counties in the state, and how everybody was looking eastward. I guess in my 5th grader mind, I was thinking everybody wants to go north, but going north would have been suicide at that time. But really, everybody is headed toward the Mississippi River. They want to get into Illinois.
and beyond that, it's mostly going toward Chicago, and then from there on north into Canada, and many states.
So this work really represents the culmination of 11 years of research and study. One of the big points that you make in the end of the book, Lowell, is the fact that as history was written, we have been taught, or were taught for many years, that the Civil War was not about slavery. It was about the sanctity of our Union. And you feel, I sense strongly, that we have been done a disservice.
Yes, well, it goes back to the post-Civil War years when everybody wanted to move on with their lives and were weary of all the war effort. And so there was this, what we call the reconciliation movement. Let's reconcile the regions. But in the process of doing that, there was the Southern effort to deny that slavery was bad. It was that they in fact had been well treated, and it was just hard cases that were involved and something like that. And but people weren't interested, and so it sort of gradually faded from the scene. The whole interest in the anti-slavery side of thing, and no one was really speaking up. You had a few books that were being put out by former slaves and stuff like that, and some of the abolitionists, but weren't getting much attention anymore. People were no longer interested in that. But I think that mood actually stayed on all the way into the 40s and 50s when I was growing up. That slavery wasn't all that bad. It was, people in the north that egged it on and got people going.
Well, I know that people do want to ask questions. This work has been going on for 11 years, and clearly there is a much richer history to the Underground Railroad in the state of Iowa than we ever suspected before that. I'm sure that many, many, many stories have been lost to history. Doug, this work continues though. What's next?
Well, and that's one of the great questions of this. What is the future of this history? And right now, it's yet undecided and undetermined. There's been a wealth of information that has been accumulated through our project, which we're hoping to make accessible online, and starting to work with some of the local historical societies, libraries, to get this information out. This information isn't going to do any good just sitting here in Des Moines. It has to get out to the rest of the state. And so that's one of the things that I would like to see happen for the future of this information and history. And the one thing that is a conclusion of our work is that we've just gotten a little bit of the information. Even with all the information we've accumulated, there's a lot left to do.
For example, we had collected up, John Zeller and Ertlana and others had collected up maybe 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 items of photocopies of newspaper articles and things. And we had digitized all that in over a period of a couple summers. And it was the hope that all that content was going to go online, but it just hasn't happened for financial reasons and layoffs and cutbacks and all that stuff. And so we're hoping that somehow that in the future, along with some of the other materials that have been developed in the project, will reach a broader audience.
And I think one thing too, with what we had originally done for the project, We had assembled information about what these people had been doing for the stories, but in a lot of cases, we really didn't know who these people were. So I've got a number of volunteers that are working here in Des Moines and around the state that are starting to look more into who these people were, and we're finding a lot more to the story than just the little piece of information that we had found originally.
Well, and as I mentioned before, the stories that you have managed to collect and publish already are incredibly fascinating. So I can't wait to find out what else you uncover.
We're hoping that it'll stimulate more people to dig into their letters in their attics and stuff like that, and some of the stories that they may have circulated among their families, and so that we can learn more about some of them around the state.
Well, let's open up the floor for questions, and if I can hear you, then I can repeat the question, and Lowell and Doug can answer the question. Anybody have something they'd like to ask? Yes.
After obtaining Canada, what was the plight of the slaves then?
So once slaves or former slaves reached Canada, what was life like?
It was tough. I've read a couple of letters that talk about what it was like this last year. You know, when they went up there and they couldn't find anything, no opportunities, and it was very cold and they weren't ready for that. But then, like the group of 12 that John Brown and his men helped go to Chicago and then Detroit and then on into Windsor, Canada, we there was a letter published a year later saying, and it was giving very, very hopeful information about what they've been raising, the various farms, who's been working out with at various places around, and that was much more upbeat than the couple, 3 letters I had read in the early 1850s.
Well, and in the book you give us a glimpse of what life was like for an escaped slave in Chicago, and that was not a very pretty picture.
No. This has to do with the Stephen Nichols effort to get back his slave who had escaped from Nebraska City, and he got a clue that they were there, and the two women, and so he got not a warrant, but a certificate to go in and retrieve. But then as soon as she was working as a cleanup person,
a housemaid in a
brothel, and so they rented. He and some big guy rented a wagon and went inside the place, and only her and another maid were there at the time, and so after the screams and shouts and stuff, they were able to get Eliza Grayson back out into the wagon, and but some local people in the black community either overheard all the screams and shouts and took notice or whatever, and so by the time they got down toward downtown, they were surrounded by black folks determined to free her, and so they took and temporarily put her into some sort of a jail thing, while they went off to get more formal papers to get permission to take her out of the city. Well, as soon as that they came back with those and took her out of the building, she was immediately snatched away from their arms and those of the sheriff, and never seen again. And he went back home bitter and having lost a lot of money in the process of trying to get her back.
Well, he arrived bitter and he went home bitter as well.
Yeah.
Another question?
Could you tell us a little bit more about the In Ray Rouse story, and particularly Alexander Butterworth and those that helped him get rid of habeas corpus to get him off the steamboat there in Dubuque? Some of the stories seem to start out as though he hadn't made his payments, but others, I think, really sound much more like a kidnapping, much more like what we saw in the movies 12 years this
the version I heard was that he was sort of slow on making his payments and stuff like that, and it sounds like Montgomery's fortunes had changed locally back home, and he was wanting to maybe get him back and resell them, but it was prevented by it. I'm not sure what the true facts of it are, but he was, a lot of local folks stopped that from happening, and then it went to a very quick trial within a matter of weeks, where they found that that since he was in Iowa, and Iowa's a free state, he is can no longer be treated as a fugitive, that he's a free man. And that's essentially sort of the opposite of what was the Dred Scott case ruled 10 years later nationally.
And I will say too that Barry Jurgensen and his students who nominated the Shattering the Silence monument up here at the Iowa Judicial Building, when they started looking into what would be left at Dubuque for this whole story, and the answer is nothing is left in Dubuque. As a matter of fact, Ralph is buried in an unmarked grave somewhere. In which cemetery was it buried? You remember? It was one of the big cemeteries in Dubuque, but he's in an unmarked grave, so we're not really even sure where Ralph's at.
And maybe everybody does know the Ralph story, but you might give a bit of context on who Ralph was and what the actual questions related to.
Right, well, and the Ralph case is what we're talking about, what Lowell was talking about too, where Ralph was a slave that had brokered a deal with his owner to go to Dubuque and mine lead and hopefully raise enough funds to secure his freedom and probably eventually his family's freedom too, I would suspect. But it didn't work out very well for Ralph, and eventually Montgomery, the owner, decided, hey, I need you back down here. And that's when things got interesting, because people were sent to bring Ralph back to Missouri. They were basically stopped in the process of taking Ralph back to Missouri by two gentlemen, and they basically forced a court trial on whether Ralph was, as a slave in Iowa, which Iowa was a free state, but he was still had his slave status. Was he really still a slave or not? And that decision said, no, you're not. If you're up here, you're free.
And that's Iowa Supreme Court case 1, so
right,
the very first Supreme Court case in the state, 1830.
Right. Yep.
I have a question then is, now you've got this audience statewide on the radio and national with the internet. What kind of questions do you have for the public? Can you not find that you just love to have the public give you some more information? What were the biggest mysteries that you were disappointed in not solving?
I don't really have a ready answer yet.
Well, I'll take a shot.
All right.
And John, you and I have had a lot of discussions about this, along with many of our friends and colleagues who are here with us today, and I thank you for coming today. My answer would be this. There's always perception that the State Historical Society has all this information in Des Moines and Iowa City, and you know, everything that needs to be known is contained there. That is absolutely not true. Matter of fact, there's a lot of important pieces of this puzzle that have yet to be found that are out in families' collections, whether it be diaries or journals or correspondence, that are literally the next, could be the next big piece of the puzzle. And one of the things that we found out about this story, because nationally the story has always been viewed as, well, these people really didn't know who they were working with. And there were people that were helping, but it wasn't really organized, and they really didn't know who was involved with these activities. Out here in the Midwest, we're finding out it's all about connections, whether it be family connections, through marriage or relations, or whether they were in the same Christian denominations and doing church things together, or sometimes a lot of these people were involved with agricultural pursuits and were involved with some very important things, including some of the major Underground Railroad figures were involved with establishing Iowa State University and also the State Fair. Oliver Mills from Lewis, Iowa would be a big name involved in actually both of those. These people were not just doing Underground Railroad activities, they were involved with a lot of things, and some of these people are very important people in the history of Iowa for other reasons.
Well, and you have to remember how difficult travel was at that time, so you weren't going to take a fugitive very far
Right.
on your own.
Right?
You needed those connections.
Yep.
John, to me, the greatest mystery is the use of the runaway slaves themselves. It's so often, and it's to be expected, the stories that we get come down from communities and people that remain and tell how they help people and stuff like that. But the runaway slaves were coming in for a week or two or three, and so those names then get forgotten, and they pass on through, and they're just treated as a runaway. And so we know the names of some, but there's so many that we don't. Just didn't stay in the community record or memory.
Well, and many of the freedom seekers only had a first name. I mean, the records were really not available.
And I have one other thing to follow up on that too. You know, the one thing is when you look at this history, look at who wrote the histories. It was primarily the white men. And so a lot of the details about these stories, rarely do you hear information about the wives and the children. And do you think that the men of the household could just do these activities in a vacuum so that the rest of the household didn't know what was going on, or that they weren't involved? And the answer is there's no way that the white men alone could have done these things. They had the help. And as we, in the earlier session today, many of the kids were actually, and we talked about this, Lowell brought this up earlier today too, many of the kids were the ones that were actually out doing the conducting and the adventurous activities.
Taking a wagon down to Missouri, right?
Yeah, hey, sounds like fun, let's go.
Well, I know Daniel had a question. Do you have time for one more?
I was going to ask Lowell to bring it full circle on the rise of the Republican Party then. You talked about the switch from the Southern sympathizer Democrats to the Republican Party, maybe founded at Crawfordsville, which was a hub of the Underground Railroad. Governor Grimes, Governor Kirkwood, on into the Civil War.
And that all connects to the Kansas-Nebraska Act that brought it all into being and gave James Grimes from Burlington the opportunity to bring that issue to the floor in his gubernatorial campaign in 1854. And it was a strong win that he had. It wasn't it was a great win, but he won the governorship. But from that point on, the tide was turning, and Republicans remained controlled for decades thereafter.
Oh, we have time to squeeze in just one more.
I've been to the Jordan House, and I think probably a lot of people know that that's one of the existing properties where they actually did have slaves. To show you the cubbyhole. And do you have any other details, though, about anybody who, you know,
Who went through the Jordan House?
yeah, any stories about them?
Yeah, well, a couple of things I might mention. One is that when John Brown and his men brought those 12 slaves from Vernon County, Missouri, up, and they were coming across the state. When they got to the Jordan's house, they stayed and pulled their wagons up in a nearby orchard, and we stayed the night there. Although John Brown kind of would stay with the master of the house, himself, but the rest of them just remained outside in a nearby orchard. And the second thing is that there was an old cabin, early cabin, and we were able to pinpoint the location of it, which is across the road. Engineer records showed it, and land records showed it. It was just across the road from where the current house is, and so with some archaeological work, one might find the outlines of that early cabin.
And also,
It was built in 1850, you know, part of the house.
right. There is one other story too. There was a later newspaper clipping, I forget the gentleman's first name, but his last name was Bell. And he was a freedom seeker, and one of the few freedom seekers that actually stayed here in Des Moines. And he actually talked about going through the Jordan property. And so there are some additional stories. And you know, that's the one thing about the freedom seekers. This was the most difficult part of the project. It's very hard finding information, and it's one of the things that I think would be a future activity that's really needed is to start looking at the black communities that came into existence as a result of the freedom seekers and other free blacks coming into Iowa. And I think you're going to start finding more information when somebody starts looking at those communities.
We know a lot more about the escapees that came during the Civil War, the so-called contrabands, because they would come into Iowa and they would stay, and they would live in communities and stuff. Whereas all the earlier runaways were moved eastward and headed to Chicago, and so there was no records then that we had in the census about where they ended up.
Iowa wasn't a welcoming place for them to stay at that time.
That's true.
And I know Lowell has a
Have
lot
we
of books to
exhausted our
sell.
20 minutes?
Yes, oh, more than that. We've had a generous 20 minutes. But thank you all so much for coming, and I know you're going to be out signing books, Lowell, and there'll be a chance to chat out in the lobby as well. Thank you so much.